are recording this and hopefully editing stuff for YouTube. Okay, so I don't think anybody had volunteered to kick this off, so I thought I'd just say a couple things that occurred to me while reading this, the chapter 5. So one thing is his presupposition that people are trying to communicate. I did sort of, that's not one of my presuppositions. So I was trying to think about, well, how did he arrive at that? I know that a lot of people in object relations do start with that assumption that there is a kind of communicative impulse first thing. And hi, Debbie. But I don't quite see how that's arrived at. I mean, it does seem to me a kind of, I suppose it's a given from the fundamental theory, right? So if the fundamental theory is that there's the mother and the baby and their interaction, then that is, it's not a huge leap from that to posit a kind of innate urge to communicate. But I'm not sure that it's actually necessary, or sometimes I don't know that it's even that helpful to put that expectation on the client. You know, why should the client be expected to be engaged in wanting to communicate with the analyst? Or, you know, why should the client's dreams or reflections necessarily be directed at some effort to communicate? I mean, he does then give, you know, some other, he talks about the drive to communicate, which I would question, but then he also, you know, posits this, he brings in Bolas with a kind of drive to represent, and Grotstein with a drive to truth. One other thing about communication is that as an idea, communication is extremely complex. So I mean, if we're talking about communication with an infant, then we can only be talking about some metaphor of communication. We can't be talking about some quite sophisticated mode of communication. But then he talks about Bolas and the notion of representation, which is a slightly different sort of thing. And then Grotstein, truth. I mean, that's a whole other bag of worms, truth. So, I mean, things that I would sort of think of would be, you know, perhaps the patient or the client is a being that wants to express itself, that there's it is giving something out, but that what it's giving out, it doesn't necessarily have to be directed to the analyst, and it doesn't have to be any sort of communication or representation, you know. It could just be some vibration or some very inchoate something. There's also struck me that I mean that perhaps there's a drive for realization. That would be different. That would go more with expression. That there's something that needs to some way I need to come into the world without a lot of reference to. I mean, he puts a big premium here on the mother's reception of the baby and the analyst's reception of the patient. But that those are, I would say, those are just assumptions, or in a way kind of dogmatic presuppositions, rather than necessarily the best way to think about it. So those kind of things made me think about the whole problem of comparative and communication and dialogue, to do with things that are totalized or globalized. So the different theories become kind of total systems, right? So this guy's system is like a Kleinian system, right? So he's talking with certain presuppositions, which are not seemingly questioned. So how can, when these systems like Klein and, let's just say Klein and Jung, or whoever, when these systems bump up against each other, is there any scope for communication or adaptation? Or are there kind of presuppositions so boundaried that there can't really be much communication? And how much knowledge do you have to have of the two systems that are kind of colliding to be able to instill or manage some kind of dialogue or comparison? I mean, can you compare the things? So, and then on page 111, he was talking about an interesting idea, which I've sort of originally took from Searle's, but in the middle of the page, he says, this is an illustration of the transference as a new creation in the here and now, not simply a repetition. The contemporary happenings in the transference generated something that could not have been realized in the past. But that reminded me of Searle's, where Searle says that, for some people, the therapy creates the unconscious. In other words, they don't actually have a repressed unconscious, but it's the process of the analysis of the relationship with the analyst and so on that gradually builds up a repressed unconscious. And then, in the way he describes here, things from the past can kind of pop up and be represented or talked about. But that you couldn't really rely on that at the beginning of the analysis. So it's the analysis itself that creates the conditions for something unrepressed to act as though it was repressed. I mean, I have one little vignette I often think about, which is this woman who, when I was seeing her, I worked in a basement flat, and up above me, they were doing lots of work on the building. So sometimes it would be quite noisy. And, but it would almost always happen that, the day would be quite quiet, and then she'd arrive for her session, and immediately the thing, the banging and the drilling would kick off. And one day she got really incensed with me about, that I wasn't providing the right environment, and this was my room and my responsibility, and I was really letting her down very badly. But out of that experience, then we arrived at the fact that she was adopted, and she had to sleep in the sitting room. And when she got up in the morning, she had to rearrange the room as though she didn't exist, right? So she had to put everything away and make sure that all the tables were clear and everything. And one day, she very deliberately left her hairbrush on the table. And her adoptive mother sort of assaulted her, and she was on the floor, and she was being kicked and screamed at and so on. So that, even though we had been working together for quite a few years, it was only that kind of transference event with the guys working and so on that actually mobilized this into a memory that could become something we could talk about. So I think that sort of resonates very well with what he's trying to describe here and what Searles is describing. Then on 113, he says something that toward the bottom of the page, he says, the paradox of nothingness is that it is full of desire, a desire to communicate. I wrote, really? I mean, it seems to me there's many sorts of nothingness, right? And to presume that emptiness or nothingness is full of something, any particular thing. I mean, that seems to me a kind of compensation, way of thinking, that if this is empty, this must be full. I mean, there's no necessity to that other than in the mind of the analyst, it seems to me. Yeah, so that was sort of my things that occurred to me reading this. One was about his real allegiance to this notion of communication, that is sort of fundamental to the activity of the patient or analyst. And the other was this idea that these systems, when they meet, how do they interact, and can they interact? But that, again, made me think of Deleuze, and he has this idea of assemblage, that assemblages are things that are hanging together, and then how does an assemblage change? And he has a whole description of how an assemblage can change. So that made me think of, well, how is it that these analytic systems, Kleinian, Jungian, or whatever, how do they change? How do they evolve? How do they adapt to other systems in their environment? And that seemed to me to be quite pertinent to the notion of comparative psychoanalysis, is how do we think about these things meeting and interacting and so on. Anyway, those might not be the things that struck you in the paper.
Well, David, what's your beef with the notion of communication? Because it depends what we mean by that, but the basic notion for me is that all human beings want to commune. So we would see that as being compatible, let's say, with social science research around infant observation, attachment theory. Anyone who's had children or been around, infants will see a desire to connect. And if we call that communication, even in physics, we refer to, or they refer to basic communion with, with the being of the universe, so to speak, information exchange between particles. And wouldn't that just simply be, wouldn't that be a form of expression too?
I mean, I did think about like the notion of connecting, but I mean, in attachment theory, an attachment isn't a communication, right? So an attachment is a kind of automatic connection of some kind, but it's not really a communication. And but there could be, things connecting internally, right? But there's also, if you say come at this with a kind of with some Jungian thoughts, then there is the whole area of the collective unconscious and collective dimensions of things. And so there are obviously in that system communications, if you like, between complexes. This comes into his idea of linking too, which he really focuses the linking on the relationship rather than linking in the mind, which I found a bit unusual because I usually think of attacks on linking as attacks within your own mind in a way.
Well, that is what Bion meant by it. But one of the things that I would say, to try to put it more in an empirical sense, is what would happen to a child if they couldn't feel themselves present in the mother's mind? And there are some ways of measuring that. You went to Bion making an assumption about this. Bion starts with the idea that how alone he felt when they couldn't communicate their experiences in the war. That's the way the chapter begins, by going over that and saying they felt desperately alone, almost suicidal, if you read his memoir. Not unusual if you're in the armed forces to see the amount of suicidal tendencies and actualities. I think in part because people can't communicate. So one of the things I would say is patients who come in and can't communicate would tend to be schizoid. That would be an empirical statement that I would make. And I think I could define behaviorally what I meant by schizoid in terms of various kinds of relationships. And that insofar as there was communication facilitated in the treatment, that would start to, cause both some internal links and some attachments. Let me not use the word links, but externally with people. That would be an empirical way that I would say that might drive me back to a more fundamental idea that most humans want to, but I would say it's a Gaussian curve. There probably are some babies that don't want to communicate, in fact, that communicate, they would be very sensitive to any kind of communication and might find it aversive. But there I'd have to develop a different hypothesis around that. But from most of the population, 2 to 3 standard deviations on either side, there would be a need to communicate. And if there wasn't communication between mother and infant, there would be some negative consequences.
I don't know if you're aware of, Auburn. He wrote this book on mysticism.
Yes.
He studied these different mystics and all the early losses they had. And then they found something in their mystical experiences that was somehow reparative or compensation, or however you want to think about it, for these early losses or absences. So from a Jungian point of view, you could say, well, they did if mother wasn't there, they developed a relationship with the mother archetype, right? Or if father wasn't there, they developed a relationship with the father archetype in some way. And I found his paper really interesting that, I mean, it seems to imply that there is something in the individual that will seek out a sort of relationship. I mean, you could say, well, those are delusional, or you could say, you know, nature has wonderfully supplied us with images that are super personal in some sort of way.
So there's a point where it comes together with the Bion perspective, that the communication generally is to find some source where they could become present in the other person's mind, which is that's the goal of the communication, to feel themselves present in another mind, and to reciprocate, and that way gradually for them to show that the other person's present in their mind. That's without using the term archetype, we could say that that's where it would occur. And could it occur by creating a fantasy, or let me not call spiritual things a fantasy, but some external source that isn't available? Yeah, I guess with some people that could be, but I think they would be at the end of the Gaussian continuum. They would be exceptional people. But I mean, for me, the question is, can you develop a theory that encompasses a range of people in your hypothesis? Not examples, but a range of people, and are there ways of testing? So just to go at the other question about how and with this chapter, I could think about ways of testing things empirically. I think Grotstein's idea of the truth drive is something that I haven't seen in the United States terribly much, but maybe it's someplace. Maybe Jim saw it more in LA, but haven't noticed it.
Mm.
Yeah, well, it's the entire foundation of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit.
Okay.
It's just truth.
I wasn't looking there.
Isn't the point that it's the person or the patient's truth? It's not the truth, it's their experience that they're trying to portray in the communication. It's the reality. It's their sense of, so they're communicating they're attacking the linking, but they're also communicating that experience. I guess that's what he was trying to bring. So it's not, it's a truth about, it's their truth, it's their reality, I suppose. Sorry, what were you going to say, Debbie?
I agree with Stephen's point about attacks on linking, and that's what we think of as Bion's idea about it. But I think that David was talking about something else when he was talking about the chapter about communication and expression, or John's idea about communication and David's idea about expression, because we're trying to find words again to explain something, but there's a difference between expression and communication, isn't there? Because you can express something without it getting communicated, or necessarily having a desire to communicate it, consciously or unconsciously, or even wanting to. Because what a patient does in the room is not, in my view, is not necessarily angled towards the analyst, because there's. I'm back to this chapter, this Bergstein. I mean, I don't know, David, if you were talking about Bergstein's view when you were saying that this guy, you know, because it's so badly written, I can't bear it. It's just so he's making a lot of assumptions, and that is exactly what we shouldn't be doing when we're talking about comparative theory. So he starts off. I just need to say this because he starts off by saying he starts off by sort of critiquing Freud, really, by saying closer observation, however, will show that these actions in fact give expression to unconscious thoughts and impulses. Then he says what Freud said about this. He that has eyes to see and ears to hear may convince himself that no moral could keep a secret. So there's the idea that we can't keep, so we just keep giving ourselves away or putting stuff out. And then he says, this to my mind is an illustration of a drive to communicate. I think that's sloppy thinking. Because I mean, it's like, well, it's not sloppy. He can write what he likes. It's his book, and he can write that if he feels like it. But it's that, you know, he doesn't explain what he means by that. Actually, I'm going with Freud on this. An expression is not necessarily about communicating. That's what I think. So in my view, you can have somebody in a room having an interaction with the room, which is something to do with the parallel but that's just my own theoretical position, that you can have a parallel transference to space and the therapist, and that you can have things going on that are an expression for the person themselves. It may get contained by the therapist's mind, and ultimately that might be a good thing, but they might not be wanting that, desiring it, or even interacting with that for a long time. And it's an arrogant assumption to assume, oh, that's it, that's communication, that's what they're doing, they're communicating with me, with the napkin and the, you know, I mean, I'd be more interested to think about what he was doing with that napkin and all the putting the napkin under the head and all that. I mean, I don't think he just everything that he says is very, I just don't think it's very well written. Then I'm just going to say one more thing about this. So he starts off with Bion's theory from 1967, and then he just goes furthermore, and then adds on a piece from 1992 with no real clarity about how it's just really badly done. And if that was an essay, I'd be writing all over it. No, you can't do that. Or if that was somebody's dissertation. Then he says the patient's material seems incoherent, but incoherence might be the communication that the patient is trying to convey Bion. But what's he saying? It's just, he just keeps adding stuff in and adding stuff in.
I absolutely agree with you about this chapter and the writing. I wasn't really talking about Bergstein. I think, as I said a couple of times ago, I think the clinical examples are poor, and the writing. And I don't think he's a good example of Bion, and there are many lack of links in Bion. I just wrote a paper on Meltzer called Missing Links, where, you know, I felt that Meltzer and other Bionians have missed the links between Freud, Klein, Bion, and the structure that Freud put forth. So I was not trying to comment on Bergstein.
I'd be interested to do your paper, Stephen. We should do your paper, because that would be interesting to do. I think I'm just fed up with Bergstein. I even missed 2 weeks, but I'm sorry. I'm just, every time I read it, I'm like, sloppy writing. So
I just didn't want you to put me in the same camp.
No, I'm not putting you. No, I'm not.
I became frightened.
No, don't worry. We should do your paper. I would love to do that. Then we could think about what you're describing.
Okay, it's a short paper.
That sounds good. I don't have so this is my first time to join the group, and so I don't have the context of Bergstein, and I assumed that there was something more kind of behind. It seemed like there were so many assumptions. I mean, he doesn't even mention, well, I assume it's a he, sorry, epistemophilic instinct. If that's his assumption, you know, there's no kind of grounding behind what he's arguing, and he doesn't attempt perhaps metapsychology even, you know, that other people have sort of tried to do. So it makes it very difficult to. It's quite a circular argument he makes in a way. There isn't a kind of basis from which you can conclude.
Yeah, but exactly what infuriates Debbie, I find interesting. That it is circular and insular, but think, quite typical of a particular frame of mind,
Hmm.
and which is,
Unfortunately true.
sorry?
Unfortunately true.
Yeah, so it's like how
What,
to,
sloppy thinking, David? Do you mean?
yes, most therapists are not good thinkers.
No, they don't know. They're not trained to write. I mean, just because, like, you know, he's got very poor writing skills. He got a book deal. Good for him. But no, I mean, why would
I
he?
agree, but what's interesting to me is how do you communicate with him, right?
Yeah, but you can't use him as an example. I said this to you last time. You can't use him as an example of a typical therapist, because that doesn't. It's not helpful. It's not useful, and also it's an assumption. So,
That's an assumption.
well, that he's a typical therapist, and therefore that's interesting because we're looking at a sloppy mind, and that's what most therapists are, and therefore that's interesting because we can then assume that most therapists think in this way, and that's what we're extrapolating from that, because we can't.
But he is an example of circular thinking and taking certain assumptions without justifying them.
He's just a poor writer, and I would not want to label any therapist at all or any clinician at all as thinking like he does. I just think it's just poor. I mean, I've been marking essays for the last 2 months, and you know, some of the essays I've been marking are better than this. So it's, you know, it's just, he's just a poor writer.
So
And
okay, yeah, okay. So maybe I'll come in here, maybe to add some defense. Yeah, I think, you know, I think first of all, actually, okay, I think you need to accept he isn't an academic, so you shouldn't really expect him to back up his assumptions. Yeah, so it's the assumption that he's making. So yes, in an academic paper, you would expect. Well, I'll just express my point of view, and then we'll see. Yeah, okay. So in an academic paper, you would expect more people to criticize, to critique their assumptions. I can, you know, myself, for example, the assumption of communication, I would take it, you know, I would go along with that assumption. Yeah, because in the sense that, you know, think of in neuroscience, you know, they talk about the default position. Yeah, so the default, what I mean by that is default position is whenever you find your mind thinking about something, it typically goes into your connections with people. Yeah. So okay. So they kind of contrast, for example, being on task, doing something, and then they talk about the default position. So which is typically when you find yourself like daydreaming, it's typically in relation to other people. Yeah. So you know, that's just, you know, that's something I would kind of say, you know, just about, you know, about that kind of myself going along with that assumption that the basic there is that basic drive to communicate. And then I think, for example, in this paper, I think it's interesting in the sense that, you know, but Bion, actually, you're right. Bion talks about attacks in the mind, but Bion also talks about attacks on linking with other. Yeah. So, for example, if you take the Bion's chapter attacks on linking 1957, yeah. So actually, he talks about it's a client with a stutter. So he talks about the client in the sense of attacking the verbal link, yep, the verbal link with the analyst, yep. So in a sense, so I think what I took from this chapter, which I thought was interesting, is so his point is saying actually that it's so if you take that kind of, if a person doesn't make the verbal link, okay, a person could assume that's attack on linking. But I think he's kind of making a point, you know, that it can be other communication other than expression, or other than just to verbalize your connection. There can be other ways to communicate.
Well, if we're going to try to be generous here to the guy,
Sounds good.
yeah, I get just to shift focus on epistemology that Lucy brings up. so the chapter was kind of having a dialectic between knowing and misknowing or not knowing. And, you know, that's something that we, all of us do or deal with if we're, I mean, for those of us who are therapists. But it also is true about the human mind. And the minus K part of the chapter, Bion and application, also reminded me of Lacan's notion of the desire not to know, because, you know, knowledge is paranoid. So there's certain aspects that we don't want to know, and hence that might facilitate an attack on the link, whether it be internally, you could even call it dissociation, or between what's happened in the analytic hour, between the client's thought processes and how they are articulated and refusing to either hear or internalize what the analyst might say. So, so to be generous here, these processes of wanting to know, the desire to know, and the desire not to know would make sense to me that they're operative together at various stages or phases or on parallel levels. And, you know, relating that back to unconscious processes, whether we call it repression, dissociation, failure at representation, you know, failure to link, you know, that this could be comparable, like in terms of a comparative approach, I would think. The assumptions, though, is that bothers me, it just bothers me from the Kleinian model, is that everything gets reduced down to the infant-mother relationship, as if that's the template that, of course, we have this in our lives, but to assume that the higher order organic developmental achievements of the psyche that we have as adults can be reduced down to our original relationships or attachment is a genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy in the Kleinian model, in my opinion, is that somehow the here and now is simply just a repetition or a reproduction of the there and then. If you just did away with the crude, I think it's by today's standards, it must be considered a crude theory of infantile development, that, you know, the baby at 3 months is devouring the mother's breast, is paranoid about it being consumed, has to regurgitate it, then it becomes paranoid again, and it has to reincorporate the content of its own projection back into its interior, and now it's going to be destroyed, or then it feels guilty and envious at the same time. And I see that as in adult relationships, but I can't buy into that as what's going on in an infantile mindset. So if I set that aside, I'm okay. But to go back to David's point, these are assumptions, presuppositions that guide the theory. And either we jettison the theory altogether and continue to be frustrated like Debbie, or we work with it in a way that we can get something out of it, despite its poor writing.
I would like to go back to something that David said about Searles, and who was a past supervisor of mine.
Lucky you.
I would agree with you. I don't know if everybody would agree with you at the end of Searles' life, but I think what Searles is looking for, and what Bergstein, or certainly Bion, is that something new is created. In fact, to call it transference, I think, is a mistake. That something new is created in the relationship, in a therapeutic relationship, that hasn't been in the person's life, before that. And that this is, I think Searles put it in terms of transference because he felt a lack of regard by American psychoanalysis in various ways of not being talking enough in Freudian terms. But I think that's what Searles is getting at, and I think that's what Bergstein was getting at as well, and certainly Bion was, around this. I would agree with John. There is a kind of genetic fallacy, even though I think with some of the patients that Bergstein is alluding to, there is a very early difficulty that these patients are going through. And the thing, to be charitable to this chapter, that I think he is saying, and that Steiner came to say, is that with chaos and splitting and repetitions, we should still regard that as important communications and something through projective identification. And that may be a difficult concept that the patient in some ways is trying to put into us for a new experience. All of that has various assumptions, and that I think in a good theory, one would have to spell out.
Yeah, I kind of think, is it not possible to accept the kind of, the Klein formulation as important piece, and say that there are other, but you'd not be able to say that this is, is this an important piece of child development, really, but accepting at the same time there are other scenarios.
Well, I would say Klein has referred to various important pieces. The way that John just condensed it, I would say most people we should leave. But I think Klein has talked about, I think, important episodic movements in each phase of development that I would put in different ways, but I think Klein has at least pointed to that. So her notion of going from the paranoid schizoid to the depressive position, I would try to put in different ways, but at least she's pointing to the beginning of certain kinds of symbolization that are necessary for what she calls the depressive position.
The issue of the genetic fallacy, I guess, is an issue in all schools of psychoanalysis, isn't it? And
yep.
What I would call the creation myth in each school is slightly different. But you could say that she described in very great detail certain psychic processes, certain imaginative processes, certain things that happen in the transference. You can say all that without linking it to infancy. But I think once you link it to infancy, then you are creating a certain kind of structure that well, then it becomes a school and a definite perspective and so on.
Definitely a school.
So, I mean, I thought if you know, for example, can you not link kind of the Kleinian fantasies with kind of, you know, the kind of the archetypes? Is it?
Well, that's what the SAP does. The SAP sees a parallel or a resonance in that way. But this is reminding me of in Neoplatonism, right? There was a big discussion about, you know, was the world created or has it always been? So it's a bit like, you know, have these fantasies always been sloshing around out there in the psyche, or did these fantasies originate in this moment of infancy and at this experience at the breast and so on? So there is a kind of, to me anyway, an interesting parallel with this sort of old philosophical problem of what's called the eternity of the world, or, you know, creation.
So, okay, so just to maybe clarify my own thing. So is Klein saying that you really need the object in order for these fantasies to emerge?
I think she's saying a lot of these fantasies are inborn, and that's where it then links up with the Jungian stuff. The baby in the old Kleinian school, the baby had all these fantasies about the mother regardless of what the mother did. So it's, you know, and so the patient had these fantasies about the analyst regardless of what the analyst did. So that position is softened a lot. Nowadays people would say, oh, well, no, it's not quite so clear cut as that. But
when Klein got to envy and gratitude, she really had changed that by 1957. When she got to that paper, she was already talking about something like the good enough mother. She had already been influenced by Winnicott. Was already talking about the good enough mother in the paranoid schizoid phase, and the inability of the child to really linger along with a whole object in the depressive position without the good enough mother. So she had already moved by then. Even her 52 paper on transference has moved somewhat from that. So I think, you know, there are early and later Kleinians. You know, the trouble is that none of these things with Bion or Klein has been put into what, say, Ernst or Thomas Nagel would call a theory, you know, with enough, and maybe that should be something we might talk about. What we consider, what do we consider the criteria for a theory, or any of these things, Jung, Klein. Do they have enough parts to make a fully working theory? And if not, what would they need? That's looking at a different type of epistemology.
are you thinking of any particular papers or books that are going into that?
Well, Ernst Nagel's book on the structure of science is still held up as an example. Thomas Nagel's book on science revisited. They're only very slightly related biologically, Thomas and Ernst Nagel, but both philosophers of science. You know, I was always very interested in Cassira's work, but people might think that's somewhat older. You know, but you know, some of Putnam's things on the structure of science. those are things that come to mind.
Well, you know, there's a whole literature base on theory, a massive literature base on what is,
Yes.
yeah, what constitutes a good theory. So, and if we assume that science is the only game in town, then that's an assumption. But any good theory would want to have to take into account a scientific you know, capacity or relation to knowledge or explanation. So, but that seems to be leading us away from what's a good psychological theory. And to me, there are certain things that would have to be inborn capacities. So like the inborn capacity for fantasy. The question is content. The question of content would maybe come in later, but in fact, when I'm thinking off the top of my head, in German idealism, you have Kant, you have Fichte, and you have Hegel as the three exemplars. And what's in common with all three of their massive systems is that fantasy and imagination, it mediates between intuition and thought, or between our capacity for sensing the world, perceiving the world, and our capacity for conceptual understanding. And fantasy has to mediate between those two. So, I'm sorry, I'm drifting off free associating here to it, but getting back to Klein and Bion, you know, it comes from Freud. I mean, really, the whole notion of unconscious fantasies. So anyway, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but that was my thought.
Someone like Cassira did put in the idea of symbol formation and fantasy and the roots to symbol formation, but just from a non-Hegelian point of view.
So linking is part of fantasy then. Is that what you're saying, John?
Well, it'd have to be involved because, you know, fantasies have to have a form, and then they would have to have a content. And they would probably have their own dynamic processes that could be you know, generative and self-regulative in some ways. If we think about how many times do we drift off into a daydream or our own fantasy during the day, in our normal day, and then your attention's drawn to it, and then you might be making a connection between it, a link. But there's also certain fantasies that probably, I would say, theoretically, could be dissociated from your self-conscious ego, but yet they are operative unconsciously in some level. And even in the example that you gave with your patient, with the noise in the construction in the apartment upstairs, dislodged something that she had either dissociated or repressed, and it now became accessible to her understanding. But I would assume it must have had some kind of semi-autonomous or quasi-agentic quality to it, or else why would it have been retained unconsciously all these years? So these are fluid things. You know, just Yeah, so
So
linking,
did David think that it had been retained all these years?
Well, I mean, well, retained somewhere, but not in a repressed unconscious.
Uh-huh. Okay.
So some people would say, well, the body remembers. I mean, I don't know if the body does, but some Sufis would say it's written in the book. But I mean, it was definitely something that she was able to get in touch with, and it was very painful. But I suppose I would think of it as it wasn't in her unconscious, it was somewhere else.
Where in your theory was it?
Well, I haven't formulated that. I would think in the family unconscious, in the collective unconscious of the family. Because I do think, families have their own unconscious, and not everybody in the family is aware of what's there, or perhaps even affected by it. Or another way of thinking about it might be that it was split off and therefore inaccessible to the ego.
yeah, but David, that still would be housed in some form of unconsciousness. It's just not going to be floating out there in space and then just somehow reinserts itself, right? It would still be within psyche.
Yes, no, definitely in psyche.
Yeah.
But psyche is not coterminous with the personal unconscious.
I mean, is this? I mean, did you at the very beginning? Did you compare that when Bergstein said? Was that a comparison at the very beginning when Bergstein said that the what's the guy's name? Tom, wasn't it? Had thought, or actually didn't have thoughts, that needed the analyst in order to have the thought.
Yeah, that was Bollas's. It's a unknown thought. No, it's the other way around, isn't it? It's an unthought known. So there's a
So I
known
think
somewhere in the
Bergstein here talking about like a thought in need of a thinker. Yeah.
Mm.
I think they're all trying to talk about something that I think is a reality.
So in your example, David, is there an aspect that you think the Kleinian approach couldn't explain, perhaps separating out the collective aspect, because clearly it might not be able to explain that part?
But it has a collective aspect because it has innate fantasy, which can only be collective.
Mm-hmm.
But that still fits in with the Kleinian approach, no? It still fits in with it. Yeah?
Mm.
What do you mean by innate fantasy?
Well, doesn't she talk about, there are images or fantasies of the breast or the penis or things that are in the baby's mind that give it a kind of direction, or in a crude way, you could say the baby looks for it.
So
that's true, but I thought the question was about your patient. is there something that couldn't be explained by either something that's split off and not available to consciousness at some periods of time, or unconscious, without really invoking the idea of the collective unconscious?
No, I think in that case you could, but in other cases you would need not this with this person, but certain things that happen in dreams and enactments and so on. To me, they need a theory of the collective. But you could, I think, in her case, go a long way with Winnicott or Klein or Searle.
In her case, you're talking about a sensory memory as well, aren't you? And that's what Searles is talking about when he's thinking about the impact of the environment, because the banging and the drilling was a sensory.
Yes,
It kicked off an experience that you can say it's in the body, or well, wherever you want to locate the unconscious process that became enacted, but it's whether it's in the body, the mind, or whatever, it got something was going on it outside that got played out that actually couldn't be thought about before, or now got thought about, started to get thought about.
No, I think she experienced the noises as an assault, you know.
But it had a very visceral sensory experience that related to a previous sensory experience, didn't it?
Yes.
I guess I don't see a need to bring in a collective unconscious, David, as much as you do, because I mean, we have to predicate the fact that all of, that mind is collective. I mean, there's a universality to mind that, there's 6 of us right here. So there's got to be something that's collective, that's universal to the human being or the psyche, without necessarily having to jump into metaphysical heaven and pull in, something mysterious out there that is believed to exist as above and beyond just the collective universality that comprises human beings. But I know that's your gig.
Yeah, but I know that you see that as something to do with transcendence, which I don't mean it at all in that way. So,
Okay, fair.
Are you just thinking about where it's stored, David? Like the memory, like almost like in the computer having something stored in an iCloud, so it's not inside the computer, but it's somewhere else in the ether.
well, I guess I don't really have a problem with the idea that psyche is, I mean, there's collective consciousness, isn't it? There's types of consciousness, forms of consciousness that are collective. They're not personal to, any person. I mean, and in a crowd, everybody, the collective consciousness of the crowd is a very palpable thing. So I think in the same way, there's collective unconscious, which has different levels of energy or valence or whatever, it has a potency to it. I don't think that's transcendence, but I do think there are, contents to it.
Yeah, I agree with you about the collective.
There are images, there are emotions, there are memories that are in the collective that do not belong to any particular person. And so so what I was thinking about with her is the collective unconscious of the family, right? So she was there at that event. The mother was there at that event. The father maybe was in another room at that event. Her birth mother and birth father are implicated in this event. So there is a kind of network of affect and memory and so on that is proper to that family. So that, I think often things are in the family unconscious, and during therapy then, I mean, it's interesting how in therapy, one person in the family is in therapy, and then suddenly another person in the family starts saying things or doing things, and you think, where the hell did that come from? You know, it seems to have in some way been generated by the fact that this person was in therapy, because they haven't talked about it or anything, but the family constellation has been shifting in some way, and that's loosened something up over here.
But isn't the thing that's loosened the sensual memory in your patient rather than the collective experience of that?
But why call it, what's wrong with the notion of the collective unconscious of the family?
Nothing.
Why does calling it sensual make it better?
It doesn't. I guess I'm trying to work out what can't be explained by Kleinian notions of unconscious fantasy, I suppose.
What I would say is I don't need the idea of collective. I also don't know how the rest of her family has internalized what's gone on. So, while you're right, sometimes when somebody goes into treatment, the rest of the family or other members of the family may be experiencing things. I think just them knowing that the person's in treatment is some kind of stimulus to various aspects of things that may be partly conscious, partly unconscious. But just to go back to your idea of collective consciousness, when everyone's in a group, there generally is an object and we're sharing an experience. And there are very similar things that people are experiencing consciously and some different things that people are experiencing consciously. So, I mean, and one could certainly call it a group experience, and if you want a collective consciousness, but I would say it's a group experience where people have shared experiences. And again, probably if you were going to do a Gaussian curve and there were enough people, a lot of people would have experienced it the same way, and at the fringes, people would experience it in different ways, depending on their sensitivities and their response to the object or the objects that are creating this experience, so that they're watching a game or listening to a speech or whatever that might be. And I don't think I need the idea of collective in that example, or with your patient's example. I think there was something that she defended against to some extent, maybe not continuously, it may have been a split off part, that the experience and the treatment brought back for her in a graphic way. And she had enough trust in you to be able to feel it in a true way. Just to mention some words.
No, I mean, I think that's very reasonable. I mean, this is but you know, like, I think it's interesting where Jung says, well, Freud was an extrovert. In other words, reality is out there, right? That's the reality is out there. So you say there's an object in this group that people are focused on or disturbed by or whatever. So there is a reality out there. Whereas Jung's saying, well, he's an introvert. In other words, there's a reality in there,
I think it's, but both are true.
Yeah, which he's calling the psyche, and that he's saying the psyche is just as real and as what's out there. So the psyche has individual and collective characteristics just as much as things sort of externally driven or externally constituted do.
But there's nothing there that I would disagree with. The psyche has internal and external aspects. I don't think Freud, I think Jung was motivated to talk about Freud as an extrovert, just as Freud was motivated in the second part of paper on narcissism to find logical difficulties in some of Jung's ideas. I won't go through it. You know, but when you say collective, it implies something that's genetic or something that's present in the species.
Well, or in the culture or the family.
And the culture and the family is very different. Then you're getting to a different level that where we could find a lot of agreement. I suspect, if I had to guess, that her family experienced some of the same things that she did, probably in a somewhat different way, and probably in a less traumatic way than she experienced. But when you use the term collective, aren't you talking about something that's epigenetic?
No, I'm not talking about genetics. I don't think the psyche is, you know, produced by matter. Psyche, I think, is just as primordial as matter.
Okay.
And humans have the peculiar vocation to be in matter and in psyche.
So you're making a conceptual or an ontological distinction, because psyche is got to be in matter. We are embodied. So,
well, there's some. Well, if you go like Spinoza, that there's somewhere where they meet or they're the same or whatever. We don't, but we can't. We don't have the equipment to know that. We can just make that as a logical deduction. So that's what Jung calls the psychoid unconscious. So that's a logical deduction that somewhere psyche and matter are the same or connected in some way that we can't actually conceptualize. But that in terms of everyday life of a human being, we experience matter and we experience psyche, and those are different. Their impact on us is different. Our experience of them is different.
well, you know, I'm preoccupied with this, David, and I've written about it. So, and I haven't figured it out yet. So I'm enjoying the dialogue.
What preoccupies you?
I think the conundrum of mind, or psyche, or Geist, or whatever you want to call it. On one hand, it can't be reduced to a material substrate alone without sacrificing all kinds of properties that we normally would attribute to psyche. Consciousness is just one of them, but self-consciousness, freedom, a number of other things, spirituality. But I can't get it out of my head that, I'm struggling theoretically with maybe that theory that Steve has brought up earlier. How do we make a coherent theory stick, where you, on one hand, people in philosophy of mind are troubled by any kind of physicalist, reductionist materialism, and they want to shift to non-reductive, materialism. They want to have their cake and eat it too. And now they've returned to panpsychism as the panacea for the hard problem issue in consciousness. But that imports its own metaphysical quandaries, such as how could the universe be psychic? How could the universe ponder itself? It makes it a hypostatization. So these are bigger fish to fry things that I'm kind of floating in space out there, trying to wrestle with. So I'll wrestle along with you if you don't mind.
Well, I probably have quite a primitive kind of view of it. I think the psyche is a kind of matter almost, but not a physical matter, if you like. In other words, it's a sort of substance, right? But not a kind of material substance.
Like energy, pure energy, something like that.
Energy, images, words, ideas, feelings.
How can we come back to the idea of thinking? Would that be helpful? I was just thinking about Walheim's idea about the thinking going on outside the mind, and I was trying to think about, in a way, does it matter where, in a sense, with the patient, there was a lot of things going on outside, literally, with the noise and the banging and everything, and she had a sensory experience, which was auditory and visual, maybe mostly auditory, which kicked off something that was unconscious, which may be unconscious inside our mind, or no, unconscious in our psyche somewhere in a concept, or in the ether, which was a collective thing somewhere, that, or in our body somewhere, that kicked off something that was a primitive feeling or experience, if you like, of emotion. Then she started to think about it inside her mind. So it was happening outside in a way that couldn't be thought about in a Bion sense. And then she started to think about it with you. So it became, in a Bion sense, contained, or it got thought about. It had the ability to be thought about. I don't know how you would conceptualize where you think the thinking's going on, David, but.
Whereas Bion, and I assume Bergstein would assume that the thinking is going on between the two of them, traveling back and forth, that even at times his immobilized mind was a message, but here, in a more dramatic way, this was a message that was going between the two of them.
As an unconscious communication, Steve, is that what you mean?
Well, I don't know at what level David was experiencing it, but I would say there must have been an unconscious element to it that was being I think, brought back and forth between the two of them, you know, at that point. And I think she felt that David could hear it and contain it and think with her about it. That's the way I would think about it.
And there was a bringing things into consciousness as well.
I think there was a bringing things into consciousness with that experience, and that there was enough containing already in the situation that she could bring it into consciousness, even though, and think about it. I think that's my version of Bion that's related to Bergstein.
So I suppose it's kind of interesting thinking about what kind of form does it have before it becomes like a thought? What form? Yeah, just
I think it's a non-linked aspect of our internal world. There wasn't, and I think linking involves communication between symbols. There was an isolated aspect of her internal world that she could finally link in an experience and with another person.
so in a sense, maybe something had to be linked in order to be experienced, in a sense, yeah?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So there was both an internal and an external aspect to it. But I think there was a history between the two of them where there was containment. So you did a good job with her, David.
I think, yeah.
We're all that she could come up with that with you and think about it.
Just listening to this part of the conversation, I suppose the thing, I've located one thing that I'm reactive about in some of these approaches, which is that I'm reactive to the idea that the person is totally constructed or created by the relation to the outside world. I mean, I do have a kind of bias that the baby or the individual is there already, right?
What set you off to that idea?
Sorry?
Who would say that the person is totally created by the outside world? I wouldn't.
No, but I
I don't.
think there.
And Bion certainly wouldn't.
No, but I'm just talking
Klein
about.
wouldn't, okay.
Sorry?
And
Klein wouldn't either.
No, Klein wouldn't.
Or Freud. None of those guys.
Okay, so I'm feeling much more relaxed now. So,
I'm just wondering how you got that from this conversation, David, or was that just a sort of free association that you were having?
well, I was thinking about my sort of reaction to his thing about communication and his whole discussion about everything happening between the mother and the baby. And, you know, I was just...
Who's Bergstein?
Yeah.
Oh, don't get me started on that again. Please stop.
No,
Why it's not? I thought we got away from that.
Oh, I'm not bothered by Bergstein's writing. I think he stimulates interesting discussions.
Apparently.
I wouldn't be reading this if it wasn't for you, David.
Anyway, our next discussion in this format is in September. I am trying to think of a different kind of topic and different sort of structure for next year. I mean, I would like to finish with the book if anybody's can tolerate it. But I would like to have a kind of either monthly or bi-monthly session where we're looking at a particular topic over the year.
I would prefer that.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, topics that have come to mind is like psyche, what is psyche, or what is an object, or various things like that. So that over the period of a year, we would look at how different people have approached that.
Maybe Bergstein has a new book.
Yeah,
Oh,
well,
please.
hopefully.
That was a joke. That was a joke.
I'll send a
I'm supposed
copy.
to do the next session as well, I think. I'm supposed to do the next one, aren't I, David? I was really hoping you were going to withdraw this book and we were doing something different next time. And
There's only one book I've ever withdrawn from a group. That was Juliet Mitchell's book on siblings.
yeah, you said that last time, or well, maybe it wasn't.
Did I
It
say
wasn't
that?
last time. It was 3 sessions ago. You said that.
I think myself in this group, I feel a little bit protective of Bergstein. So something, you know, I feel I want to protect him from you
Yeah,
guys.
I'm not sure why, really. I don't know why.
More attacks on linking.
Yeah, well, so anyway, if you have any ideas about what would be an interesting theme for next year, and ideas about what kind of frequency you could you would be interested in, and then that would be helpful if you sent those along to me. But thank you for this discussion.
Okay. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
So
Have a
Have a
nice
good
summer.
summer, everyone.
have a good summer. And,
Anyway, thank you.
enjoy the football if you can.
Yeah. Okay. Bye, everyone. Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.